You've probably heard that old saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, back in 1921, that wasn't just a saying, it was literally true. Think about it. From Cape Town to Cairo, from Delhi all the way to Darwin, it was just this unbroken chain of territory, all under one flag. So the question is, how? How did this happen? It's a really fascinating puzzle when you stop and think about it. One that history books sometimes just skim over. I mean, how did this relatively small, rainy island, without a huge population or a ton of natural resources, how did it manage to outcompete and, in many cases, completely dominate massive rivals like China, France, and Spain? Well, that's what we're going to dig into. There were, as we'll see, 4 master keys that Britain used to unlock the world. And the scale of this thing, it's just staggering. I mean, at its peak, the empire controlled a quarter of the entire globe. Let that sink in. 1 out of every 4 people on planet Earth lived under British rule. The story of how this all happened, though, it doesn't start where you might think. It doesn't start with a king or a great general. No, it starts with a balance sheet. So let's talk about that first key. It reveals a really surprising engine behind this massive expansion. You know, when we think of empires, we usually assume it's governments, kings, and armies that conquer territory, right? But for Britain, the initial push came from somewhere completely different, from the world of business. And that business was a single corporation, the East India Company. Now, this was not your average company just trading spices and tea. For over 100 years, this was a private business that was, for all intents and purposes, running huge territories like India for profit. It had its own private army, minted its own currency, and wrote its own laws. All this long before the British government ever officially stepped in. So how could a private company get that powerful? Well, it was all thanks to a truly revolutionary financial idea, the joint stock company. Britain absolutely perfected this model. It allowed regular citizens, not just the super rich, to buy shares and invest in these incredibly risky overseas ventures. It was, in effect, the world's first crowd-funded empire. And that created a huge psychological shift, you see. Building an empire wasn't just some far-off project for the king anymore. It became a national venture that pretty much anyone with a little extra cash could buy a piece of. And this model gave them a massive advantage over their rivals. Just look at Spain. The Spanish king had to personally bankroll his colonial ambitions. All the risk was on one person. If a venture failed, he lost big. But Britain? They could draw on the wealth of their entire merchant class. This spread the risk out, and it massively increased the amount of money they could raise. It meant they could afford to lose ships, they could afford to lose a few battles here and there, and still stay in the game to win the long economic war. Okay, so they had the money sorted. With that corporate engine humming, Britain turned its attention to the second key, achieving an absolute mastery of the seas. Really, this was the foundation that everything else was built on. Now, we've all heard the phrase, Britannia rules the waves, but it's a bit misleading to think it was just about having the most ships. The real genius was in how they used their fleet. See, while other countries were building navies mostly to defend their own coastlines, Britain was building what you could call floating fortresses. These were ships designed for long-haul missions, engineered to stay at sea for months at a time, projecting power anywhere on the globe. But a fleet like that needs support, so they built this incredibly strategic network of naval bases and coaling stations all around the world. Think of places like Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, Hong Kong. They weren't just colonies. They were like the vital pit stops, the refueling stations, in a global web that gave them total control. And this gets to the very core of their naval strategy. The British realized something brilliant. They didn't have to conquer every single piece of land. They just had to control the vital sea lanes, the choke points that all global trade had to pass through. If you control the water, you control the flow of money. All right, so that brings us to our third key. They have the money and they control the seas. But then a new technology comes along that's going to cement British power in a way the world had never, ever seen before. And this new weapon, it wasn't a bigger gun or a faster ship. It was information. Specifically, information delivered through a massive network of undersea telegraph cables. They called it the All Red Line because on old world maps, British territories were always colored red. This incredible network connected London to pretty much every corner of its empire. It was, for all intents and purposes, the world's first internet. And the change in speed, it's almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Think about this. In 1800, a message from London to India had to go by ship. It took 6 months. 6!
By 1870, with the telegraph line in place, that same message arrived in minutes. Not days, not hours, minutes.
And here's why that was such a game changer. It wasn't just about saying hello faster. This was a profound strategic advantage. It meant that London could move troops, react to price changes in markets halfway around the world, and crush rebellions with a speed that was just unimaginable to its rivals. They didn't just have more power, they had better, faster information. They could see the whole board while everyone else was still waiting for the mail to arrive. So you've got these three keys: corporate funding, naval power, and information control. Together, they built the empire. But our fourth and final key is maybe the most important for us today. It explains why, long after the British Empire officially ended, its influence didn't just disappear. The systems it put in place are still shaping our world in some really fundamental ways. Because the most enduring legacy of the empire, it isn't the buildings or the bridges it left behind. It's more like an invisible framework. You could think of it as the operating system that much of the modern world still runs on today. So, what are we talking about when we say operating system? Well, first, there's the English language itself, which is still the default for international business, science, and diplomacy. Then you've got the legal principles of common law, which is the foundation of the legal systems in places like the US, Canada, and Australia. And third, that model of global finance, the one pioneered by those early joint stock companies, that's still the absolute bedrock of our global economy. Now, of course, this legacy is incredibly complex. It's not a simple story of good or bad. For every bridge they built, resources were extracted. For every railroad they laid, local cultures were changed forever. History is never black and white, and the empire's legacy is absolutely one of both, wreckage and wonders. It left behind progress, but also deep and lasting pain. And all of this leaves us with a final, pretty challenging question. We can't go back and change history, but it's crucial that we understand it. So when you consider everything, the good, the bad, the innovations, and the injustices, is the modern world we live in today better or worse because the British Empire existed? That's a question we're thinking about.